Hello, this is the Gifted Assessment 3, and my choice of the two myths was going to be the George Orwell myth, which is that myths that are believed in tend to become true. So, we begin then. My myths are going to be, first of all, that gifted programs are elitist and hence unfair. My second myth will be that it's all about nature, and my third myth will be the contrary of that, the opposite of that, that it's all about nurture. I take as a starting off point a quote that I particularly like from Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who was the author of Flow, writing about complexity. Following a flow experience, the organization of the self is more complex than it had been before. It is by becoming increasingly complex that the self might be said to grow. Complexity is the result of two broad psychological processes, differentiation and integration. Differentiation implies a movement towards uniqueness, towards separating oneself from others. Integration refers to the opposite, a union with other people, with ideas and entities beyond the self. A complex self is one that succeeds in combining these opposite tendencies. I am of the belief that what we should look for in our students and indeed in ourselves is as great a complexity as possible. And I rather like this quote from Csikszentmihalyi, and I like it because we first of all, I suppose this is in any form of education, but particularly in giftedness, we focus, I believe, via differentiation to bring out the individual strengths, to foster the individual characteristics and gifts in a person. And in order for that to happen, we want to move away from the idea that everyone is the same. And by focusing on the individuality of our students, we can actually allow them to flourish. Once they flourish, they are then able to, I suppose, integrate back into their cohort, into their community with greater strength, hopefully, than perhaps they had before. And so, essentially, by encouraging their individuality, they are able to connect to a higher platform, a higher purpose, and actually realize that they are, in fact, and I mean this, I suppose, as positively as possible, that they are no different to anyone else in a negative sense, that they are actually simply connected to something greater than just themselves, and that would be, I suppose, the integration part of it. So, gifted programs are elitist and unfair. It's all about nature and it's all about nurture. Here we have a slide of George Orwell, or rather George Orwell's Animal Farm. Perhaps his greatest, or most famous, not his greatest, but perhaps his most famous work, probably along with 1984. I'm interested, and I use this image because I believe that, I suppose, like any of the great tragedies, very often it's our greatest strength that is in fact our tragic flaw. And in Australia, perhaps our sense of fairness and our sense of equality is a great strength. Our sense of community in this country is a huge strength. And yet, with that can come a fear of difference. And there's no need to, I believe, fear difference, especially in a country like Australia that is actually so brave and so bold and so daring. Perhaps unlike my and George Orwell's own countries of England, Australia actually looks towards being daring and bold, and one has only to look at the National Disability Insurance Scheme being enacted at the moment to see the strengths of this idea of fairness. And it's, I suppose, really whether or not we can bring that sense of fairness into our dealings with an opposite end of the spectrum to those with impairments, which is those people with gifts. And even in this story, which admittedly I haven't read for a while, of Animal Farm, you have, with the best hopes and the best of, I suppose, the best instincts, the best dreams, are actually hoping for this idea of fairness, but then, through seeking this fairness without necessarily thinking deeply about it, there are some flaws, and you have, I suppose, then the pigs as this symbol of the the first among equals. You have this idea that actually, in seeking fairness, but in seeking fairness too stringently, then you actually deny the individuality. And so, yes, again, with the best of intent was the word I was looking for. With the best of intentions, there's actually unfortunate repercussions of that. Yes, I believe that this idea of fairness is very important, and I think that when it's Dr. Miraka Gross, writes wonderfully about this when she discusses how, and then she compares it actually to our sort of educational treatment of those with learning impairments. And if we see this as simply, again, a reflection of people and all of their individual strengths, their individual weaknesses, and we focus on those things, then we can we can allow these significant gifts in many people to thrive. Now, we had in the 1980s, I think it was, we were introduced, I'm not sure particularly deeply, but to the concept of giftedness through this chirpy little fellow, Doogie Howser, MD. And there was this, I suppose, for me, this reflection of a cliched image of giftedness, the child who can be a little bit annoying, but actually has these profound natural skills, natural talents. There's an ancient Greek phrase, gods mock those that they first call talented. When early investigations were held into giftedness, Francis Galton focused largely on this idea that it was all natural, and he was trying to look at people that were successful in his society, and he was trying to look and see the things that they all sort of held in common. And we had a relatively frightening, I suppose, by modern standards, a relatively frightening concept that it was all about nature and that one was born to be gifted. And that this, I think, gradually as time has gone on, even at the beginning of the 20th century, when you have Tannenbaum and you have Terman, or particularly Terman, actually, I'm thinking of, and people looking at their I suppose these relatively, I don't even know, we want to say sort of homogenous groups, but seen specifically, I suppose, ideas of giftedness that were chosen by teachers or identified by teachers, and very much based upon this idea that that these people had the G factor, that they had this sort of innate giftedness. When the Iliad begins, the Iliad of Homer, the first work of Western literature, you have this idea that there is the poem actually begins with "Sing to me, O muses," and you have these ideas. The first word is men in the ancient Greek word, which means anger, and you have this sort of idea of natural talents filling the whole of the poem, and this identity of natural talents in the ancient world is very much, I suppose, exemplified by the gods. You have sort of representative of natural abilities, whether that be wisdom for Athena or strength for Ares or something along those lines, and that you have the muses themselves as being these sorts of moments of inspiration, that it is all innate. And for so long, and even in my experience as a teacher, for so long, when you spoke to other teachers, it would be the idea of, well, this person's just not clever enough for specialist maths, or this person's just not clever enough to do Latin, or whatever it might be. And thankfully, I believe that idea of it all being only about nature has been challenged, and increasingly now we have, I suppose, society, education moving towards more the actual the processes that lead a person to be gifted, and until you have, I suppose, the extension of this, the opposite end of the spectrum of this, whereby it's all about nature. You have the current focus on resilience, and another term, grit, which is referred to in those terms by Angela Duckworth. And Angela Duckworth, who writes that actually hard work, motivation, is twice as, and this was, of course, one of Renzuli's key areas of his concept of giftedness, that it was actually sort of so much about motivation, and it was all about motivation. And we move away from the Doogie Howser model to this new sort of idea. And I remember thinking about it with the Beatles, and this concept of the Beatles, perhaps my favourite group, and you have this idea of the Beatles. I sort of imagine, picture yourself on a boat on a river with tangerine trees and marmalade skies, and then someone tells you that actually your favourite group, the Beatles, aren't all that talented at all, and that suddenly I'm there thinking of John and George, and to a lesser extent perhaps Paul and perhaps to a far lesser extent, Ringo, and all of my ideas of their natural giftedness is completely wrong, according to Malcolm Gladwell in his very popular works at the moment, whereby he's going, no, it wasn't about any natural talent at all. It was that they'd done their 10,000 hours in the clubs of Hamburg, while others were still sort of doing their rehearsals. That it's all about actually just the work. It's all about the process. It's all about the hard work. And this sort of challenged my concepts. And now we have this idea where people have sort of flipped completely over onto the other side, where it's all about how hard you work. It's all about whether it's this word grit or whether it's growth or whatever it may be, whatever sort of educational buzzword we have at the time, that it's actually all about the processes and not at all necessarily about the natural abilities. And when I speak to my colleagues, certainly in terms of management, this is very much a thing. I find myself, when I talk about any idea of nature, the importance of an innate ability, actually really sort of coming up very often against brick walls. And again, if we were to look at these sorts of ideas of fairness, then first of all, then I'm reminded of a story that Dr. Gross spoke about in one of her articles of Mr. Palkuzzi, the head teacher, the principal of an American high school, talking about a new program that he wants to offer for gifted students, whereby they're going to be accelerated and they're going to get in a special teacher and a special program, and it's going to be all subsidized by the parents' fees, etc., etc. And the parents in this parent committee meeting were all up in arms, and then he simply explained that actually this was what they were already doing with the basketball team. And I think this is entirely true in Australia as well, that if you speak to people about natural gifts, people have no problem at all believing in natural gifts for football or rugby or whatever it may be, but you end up talking about perhaps other forms of gifts, and they're very, very reluctant to sort of accept these things. I do believe that, again, looking at individual stories, and in my experience, that can be stories of young people reading at a very young age. And parents are very good to speak to if you want to find out about sort of the early behaviours and ideas of sort of whether it be sort of forms of movement at a prodigiously early age, or yes, reading at a very young age. That when people are actually introduced to that, perhaps it makes it slightly easier. And I think that also it is perhaps the sort of idea of it all being about nurture can be sort of encouraged by our society, because there's that large focus on the socializing sort of impact of it, and it makes it easier to sort of believe it's certainly a softer, cuddlier ability to believe that anyone can do whatever they want as long as they work hard enough, which isn't necessarily what Duckworth or Dweck are trying to say. That it isn't necessarily that I can play, that I can swim for Australia or swim for England if I want to hard enough. It's simply actually more that I can swim a lot better than I do at the moment if I work at it, and if I actually embrace swimming rather than the idea of actually saying I'm going to be the greatest swimmer that the world has ever seen. That, as Duckworth says, that trees don't carry on growing into the sky, and that there is such an importance of nature. I find with this in view, I find that perhaps of the various different models of giftedness, one that I'm just showing you here, which is one by Gagne, and is perhaps that which is held most prominently in Australia, is the DMGT, differentiated mode of gifts and talents. One crucial thing that happens here with Gagne is that he does separate the gifts and the talents. And so with these notions of nature versus nurture, and even fairness, which is perhaps governed by the chance as well, or that's sort of involved in it, that we have this difference between the potential of the natural abilities and then the actual talents, which is when things are working. And if we were to adopt this, I suppose, model, then perhaps when you have these natural gifts on the left-hand side, whether they be intellectual, creative, social, perceptual, muscular or motor control, and the physical ones, it still leaves room for those important, I used earlier on educational buzzwords, but the terms and the ideas that so many teachers are so interested in, of grit and growth, etc., etc. The importance of flow, and I really would like to sort of stress the importance for me of flow, the idea of this, the notion of challenge in what one's doing, and the importance of challenge for gifted students, and that perhaps many problems can happen when gifted, or frankly, any students aren't sufficiently challenged in order for them to be in their sort of optimal state. That there are certain areas, that there must be clear goals, that there must be feedback, and that there must be this, as I say, correct level of challenge, and that perhaps very often we're not challenging our gifted, at least the highly gifted, moderately gifted. And we talk about this idea of the top 10%, and then it's the top 10% of top 10%, and the top 10% of that as we're going progressively up the scale. But that certainly by the time you're getting to sort of beyond the mildly gifted, that our schools need to not simply just provide for such students, but to actually have specific programs for them that will increase all of these various different areas of physical, mental awareness, motivation, and volition, etc., etc. And those will also, again, if we're looking at the flow, these can also counteract these two ideas that Csikszentmihalyi talks about quite a lot, of anomy, French word, and alienation, and that anomy, which is the word for a lack of rules, when a person is unsure of the rules for their society. And I think of this, and I consider actually how many students actually aren't sure with these gifts of how to behave, because they're so fascinated by the complexity of the universe, or stars, or ancient Rome, or whatever it might be, and they can't quite figure out why everyone else isn't as fascinated, all the other 6-year-olds aren't as fascinated by high-level algebra as perhaps they are. And then you have the alienation, which is almost the opposite of this, when people are forced to actually go against what comes instinctively to them. And so when you consider this and what one can be doing, then certainly acceleration in various other forms, various other programs could well counteract these two ideas, both of which sort of end up very often corresponding, as Csikszentmihalyi identifies, to anxiety for anomy, and then alienation or boredom. And one thinks of of perhaps some of the problems that we have with students, and these high levels of disengagement and high levels of underachievement for students. I would then finish it off with, again, where I began, to the complexity, following a flow experience, and looking at this different thing. So if we consider the Gainia model, that perhaps, and we consider all of the different ideas, rather than just focusing on nature, rather than just focusing on nurture. If we consider the fairness as being a representation of a person's eudaimonia, the ability to flourish in whatever individual way is authentic to you, then perhaps this idea of complexity, and I believe the DMGT model is perhaps the most complex, that allows for the individual and the individual's personality and innate gifts to be, and innate potential to be acknowledged, which can then, I suppose, with the right work of the teachers, the families, can then allow that person to function as positively as possible in his or her environment, with his or her community, and thus be most successfully integrated, and then hopefully reach that greatest level possible of eudaimonia, or flourishing. Thank you very much.